Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, why John Brumby wants Victorian school kids to harden up, how anonymous online abuse can be good for democracy, and what are our ex-Prime Ministers really like? A confidant to some of our former leaders shares his insights. Our panel tonight, Miriam Lyons from the Centre for Policy Development, Chaz Licciardello from the Chaser, and Chris Berg from the Institute of Public Affairs. First up tonight, the opposition is stepping up its campaign for closer scrutiny of Labor's national broadband network. The coalition says it's hypocritical for the government to ask the Productivity Commission to look at the issue of carbon pricing, but not high-speed internet policy.
The national broadband network, I think, is a $43 billion white elephant. They're terrified, absolutely terrified, of having this subjected to serious cost-benefit analysis because they know it wouldn't stand up. They know that this is school halls on steroids. They know that this is a rerun of Pink Bats, only on a gargantuan scale. And they are hoping against hope that they can anaesthetise the public with this kind of cargo cult vision of marvellous services sprouting everywhere for nothing.
Prime Minister Julia Gillard says the opposition is simply trying to delay the rollout of the NBN. Meanwhile, independent MP Rob Oakeshott agrees with the Greens' proposal that the government should release the NBN business case before Parliament rises for the summer break.
I think it would be pretty disappointing and not terribly respectful to the Parliament at the end of the year and the so-called new paradigm if we're going to sit these last 2 weeks and then see the business case put out by NBN. So I've written to the Prime Minister and having as many conversations as I can. And look, I understand processes are difficult. There is a cabinet process that's a reality. It is an over 400-page document, but bring it on.
Chris Berg, I know you don't agree with the Greens often, but you agree with them on this one about releasing the business case before the end of the year.
Yeah, I think so. To be honest, I'm not sure how anybody could disagree. I don't think anybody's going to the wall saying that the public shouldn't be provided with any information. I think it's a really interesting development, and to a large degree, it shows how successful Malcolm Turnbull has been in the shadow communications portfolio. A lot of people thought when Malcolm Turnbull, when Tony Abbott gave Turnbull that portfolio, it was a trap. How could you oppose, how could it be your job to oppose this extraordinarily popular government program? But I think we've seen over the last couple of months how Turnbull has been able to really bog down the political debate over the broadband network into conversations about the business case and of course the cost-benefit analysis. And the government, I don't think they really have a response to that, and it's looking pretty bad. Well,
Miriam, the response from the government is that they are going to release it. They just got to wait a little while. They want Cabinet to see it, and then they want to remove all the commercial in confidence provisions. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, look, I think that it's definitely a good idea to release it, and I think that it's reasonable to take some steps to, make sure that they're not breaching the commercial in confidence requirements. But I have seen a lot of these kinds of studies, governments actually using commercial in confidence as an excuse not to release it. So I really wouldn't like to see that happen. We're going to need, lots of public scrutiny of this over the coming years. The more scrutiny, for the better for an investment of this size, really. So I'd be keen to see commercial in confidence not used as an excuse not for releasing the documents.
Chaz, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, look, I'd love to see it released as long as I don't have to read it.
Yeah, well, it's 400 pages.
That's right. But what I'd say is that I don't think if the government is stonewalling, I don't think it's very smart, because in this particular parliament, every vote counts, and they just can't fob off the Greens because they need the Greens' vote eventually. And so if the Greens want to make a big deal out of it, if Malcolm Turnbull wants to make a big deal out of it, they can't avoid it. You just can't avoid the issue. You could put it off for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. It's going to catch up with you eventually. So I don't think there's any point hiding.
It is interesting. Yeah. I mean, it is already getting rolled out. And I saw that one of the independents had said that they were keen to find a way of getting greater scrutiny without actually, your choice of words, Chris, bogging down the process. And I think that is important. It is difficult to do straightforward cost-benefit analysis on schemes of this scale where the potential payoffs are, short-term but also far into the future. So over those long time frames, it is quite difficult. On
that issue, Chris, it was interesting that Warwick McKibben, the prominent economist and Reserve Bank board member, today said on The World Today that he thought that there should be a cost-benefit analysis.
I think absolutely there should be. But as Miriam points out, it's really hard to do a cost-benefit analysis of this type. And because it's so vague, you can pretty much get it to say whatever you want as long as you provide the right parameters from which it can work. After all, we're talking about future technologies that we don't really know and applications we won't or we can't predict at the moment. So you can really get that cost-benefit analysis to prove whatever you want. Now, I think it's a really, really important task that has to be done. I think you've got to do due diligence on this. But when Malcolm Turnbull and the Liberals and now the Greens are pushing for a cost-benefit analysis, what happens if it comes back and it says that NBN is a great idea? I think they may snooker themselves. So they've got to be very, very careful about this, the myopic focus on the cost-benefit analysis and focus more on what I think is the important issue, which is how will the telecommunications industry look after such a huge investment and such a huge government intervention in what we'd already privatised 10 years ago.
Well, and if you look at it's the Productivity Commission, they care about productivity. Clearly, our current telecommunications system is inadequate. We do need to replace it with something. There is a case to be made that this is going to be a natural monopoly, and therefore it's probably better off in public hands and actually being built by the government. The Productivity
has spent the Productivity Commission. The Productivity Commission has spent years looking at the telecommunications industry. They've never turned around and said, well, you've got to replace it with a national broadband network. They've provided all sorts of regulatory reform proposals instead.
Moving on to other issues, and the plight of asylum seekers is once again in the spotlight with another hunger strike underway at Sydney's Villawood Detention Centre. About 160 detainees are staging the action following the suicide of a 41-year-old Iraqi man in the early hours of this morning. That's the second suicide in less than 2 months at Villawood. The Immigration Department admits detention can be tough, but it says conditions have improved.
Where there are large numbers of detainees in a detention setting, where there are difficult decisions and challenges facing those detainees when they don't secure the outcomes that they may be wishing, that it can manifest itself in behaviours that do lead, unfortunately, to sometimes, rarely, but sometimes these sorts of outcomes. We are looking very closely at the steps that we might be able to take to ensure that there's not a repetition, but we can never guarantee that.
And the Greens have today renewed their call for an overhaul of the entire immigration system. Miriam, this is the second suicide at Villawood Detention Centre in 2 months. Is it time for a review of the immigration detention system?
Absolutely. I mean, suicide is always tragic, but it's particularly tragic when there's so much that we could do to bring the risks of suicide down. And I really do think that our policies have contributed to increasing those risk factors. There's a lot of evidence that when people are locked up in a detention, basically treated like criminals, that really is a very difficult situation for people who have undergone a lot of trauma. And the fear of being returned to places where they've experienced that trauma can actually re-traumatise them. So I really think that we're failing in our duty of care here. And we were supposed to, in 2008, we were supposed to have introduced a risk-based detention system. We were supposed to be doing basic security checks, checking that people weren't a flight risk, and then releasing them into the community. Now, that then didn't apply to people on Christmas Island. And I understand this guy spent something like a year on Christmas Island. That's just unacceptable.
Chaz, what do you think?
Well, look, I mean, obviously, like Miriam says, when you have a detention system, people are going to get depressed. It's human nature that when you're in detention, no matter how comfortable the conditions are, there are going to be people who will react very, very poorly to it. The question is, I suppose, how you deal with it. We should remember the government did actually a month ago have a certain degree of reform with the children in the detention centres, and I think there's definitely a case for more reform. But what I would caution people to do is to make sure that obviously the community is on one side of this debate, and it's not necessarily on the side of the people at this table. And what we need to do is, I think we need to progress at a steady rate, but not at a rapid rate, because in the long run, this system's going to get worse and worse and worse. Like with climate change and all the rest of it, you can be sure in 20 years' time, it's not going to go away. Like, we're going to have to deal with the refugees for a long time, and I think it's the most important thing is that we get right.
Chris Berg, the recent High Court decision too could put more strain on the detention system, with people spending longer times in detention as they are able to have more legal rights and pursue those through the courts.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and that's why I'm a bit disappointed with the Greens focusing on the detention being the specific problem in this case. My understanding of the man who committed suicide was that he'd actually been rejected for asylum twice. That indicates to me that the detention isn't the problem. It's the systems and support and the processes by which people try to claim asylum and work through the courts are being processed. And so I'd like to hear more focus from the party that rightly and I think perfectly reasonably stands up for the rights of asylum seekers. I'd like to hear more from them about those processes rather than focusing on the specific detention and whether individuals are kept in the community or in temporary detention centres. I want to hear more about the legal processes, and I think that's where the movement has to happen here.
The detention is one of the factors. I don't think that you can get away from the fact that locking people up and treating them like criminals is one of the factors in making people more depressed than they would otherwise be. But
in this case,
you do raise an important issue about that fear, and the lack of support for people who fear that they will end up getting returned home. Yeah. And there is something, I think, that is quite inconsistent about how we deal with that. So we treat, somebody who is in danger of receiving the death penalty, Gabe Watson. We want an assurance that he won't be receiving the death penalty before he's returned home. And yet, people who have been refused asylum, it's often just because they don't fit a particular definition of refugee as it's in the Refugee Convention. They may still be at risk when they're returned home. So I think that we need to act on that as well. Some of the people that we have returned home through past policies, they actually have been killed when they've returned, say, back to Afghanistan.
Okay.
So we have a duty of care there.
Moving on to other political issues, and Labor has moved to stop a potentially damaging rift over the party's official stance on gay marriage. The federal government has decided to support a Greens motion calling for more debate on the issue and urging MPs to canvass the views of the electorate. Meanwhile, Sports Minister Mark Arbib has been forced to deny he's been pulled into line over his support of gay marriage.
I've made my personal view known. I support same-sex marriage. In terms of what the process is, one option could be a conscience vote. I believe it is a matter of conscience. But, again, the party works within its national platform. The national platform is debated and its policies are debated at the National Conference, which will take place sometime before the next election, and that is the appropriate forum for the matter to be discussed, and if any changes take place, that's where the changes will take place.
The Prime Minister has so far ruled out a conscience vote on the issue. Chris, this seems like an unusual motion before Parliament, asking MPs to consult with their constituents.
I think it's a devastatingly critical motion. The very idea that there should be a vote in Parliament as to whether politicians try to represent their constituents, it just shows you